All right. Good afternoon. My name is Rachel Sterling. I am a housing attorney and communications coordinator here at Homeline, and we are going to be getting started with our webinar here in just a minute or so. I see that people are slowly ticking in, so we'll give everyone just another minute or so to log in, but then we will get started. Today's webinar is going to be about the 2023 legislative renters agenda that Homeline will be talking about throughout the next legislative session. Uh, so again, we'll get started here in just a minute or so. All right, I have waited my requisite promised minute, and so we can go ahead and begin. Um, Welcome everyone to the December Homeline webinar series. This has been a ongoing series for a couple years now. Today's agenda we are going to be talking about is the Minnesota renters agenda that we have for the 2023 legislative session. We are being joined by our policy director, Michael Dahl, and as well as our managing attorney, Mike Farah. So just a little bit quick about Homeline. Homeline is a statewide nonprofit organization. We specifically help tenants navigate what their rights are under landlord tenant law here in Minnesota. We've been around since 1992, and we have advised over 260,000 tenants in those 30 odd years. Our primary focus is our free and confidential hotline. We do offer that in 4 languages. And those are Spanish, Somali, Hmong, and English. We also offer an email and attorney option if email is a preferred method of communication. This is all of our contact info right here. So that is kind of the nitty gritty about Homeline. We are going to get into our presentation for the day, but first I want to let folks know, in case you haven't been one of these before, this is being recorded, and we will post it to our website in just a couple of days once that recording is finished doing its thing in the cloud. But if you have questions, we absolutely encourage questions. We like questions. Michael will be able to answer questions regarding policy, legislative process, that sort of thing. So if you can use the Q&A function, don't put things in the chat. We won't see it. I think it actually has been disabled now at this point anyway. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We will get to them. We'll have a Q&A time at the end. And if it's something that is hyper relevant to what is being discussed at the moment, I'll try and slip it in if it is workable during our discussion here. But again, questions highly encouraged. Mike Farah is a managing attorney here at Homeline. He is also, and I'm an attorney here at Homeline as well, I should say. So if there are, I guess, non-policy questions, we can answer them, but we would like to focus specifically on policy and legislative things for this session. Take advantage of having time out of Michael's busy schedule to actually sit and talk with us about this stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Michael and put myself on mute and pop in as necessary. All right, thanks, Michael.
You betcha. Good afternoon, everyone. As was said, my name is Michael Dahl, and I'm the Public Policy Director with Homeline. Professionally, I've been working on housing, homelessness, and renters issues for 28 years. And if you include my days as a college activist, that would be 33 years. So um, other than some brief periods of unemployment where I threw trees off of a Bachman's truck for a while, this is what I've done. I've specialized in this area because I care deeply about affordable housing, the needs of people experiencing homelessness, and obviously renters who are in trouble and need more stable and safe and secure and comfortable housing for themselves. I advocate primarily at Homeline on the state and federal level issues, and then sometimes work on local issues. But my main area is state and federal. And I want to say I feel honored to work at Homeline. A couple of reasons. One is, as Rachel said, we've been doing these webinars for a couple of years now, and it started because of the pandemic. And when that pandemic started, we started to see an explosion of calls and also tenants that were facing things that they needed to organize regarding. And I feel, as I said, honored to work with Homeline staff because I've just seen the incredible work that we've done. Um, and the stress that it also entails in trying to help people out through some very difficult situations. And what we're going to talk about today is some things that we can do to actually change the environment so that renters have more protections and help them out. I'm also honored to work at Homeline because we do direct service, organizing, education, and advocacy all under one roof. So our tenant hotline staff and our organizers frequently tell me about unfair struggles that some of our clients and those we organize with experience. And each of those policy measures we push for come directly from the needs expressed by our clients and those we organize with. But before I get into that and their experiences and the policy changes that leads us to consider, I'd like for us all to put ourselves into the shoes of a tenant shopping for an apartment or shopping for a home. Um, and as you can see on this list, it has home amenities like a 2-bedroom apartment with a nice dishwasher and laundry, light access. It includes things like going through a walkthrough and feeling comfortable with management and the fact that repairs are made and that staff are accessible fairly quickly when issues are come up, and that tenants review the landlord and the management well. Um, Regarding the rent, that it's affordable, that's something that's obviously part of a staple of a happy home is you can afford the rent. And then also includes things like um, the landlord seems like you have a good rapport, and that you can I'm that good relationship is there. And then there's pet fees. There's having hey, this person has a cat. They want to bring the cat. They'd like for there not to be excessive pet fees. And then for the kids, sometimes act also like pets, that, they have a place to play and there's a playground nearby. So that would be a shopping list that renters would have as they're going around and looking for an apartment. And the question is, will the tenant get what they want? And, it's perhaps, obviously the rent needs to be affordable. And that brings all of those other things in that, beyond being affordable, that there's a desired list. But there are other considerations as well that sometimes tenants don't take into consideration right off the bat. Um, but they go beyond the basics and the amenities of the apartment. We want tenants to remember that they're not only shopping for an apartment or a home, they're shopping for an acceptable landlord, management, and a lease. Unfortunately, there is a power imbalance between landlords and tenants. Landlords write the leases, that's just a fact. And those leases are often not up to negotiation. I certainly have not heard of many cases where someone can uh, uh, Actually, some people, and in fact, some policymakers believe that a lease is signed between two equal partners. And I have yet to hear of periods where a renter goes through and they cross out huge sections of the lease that they find unfair. And both the tenant, potential tenant, and the landlord put their initials next to it, and everything's all good. The agreement is set with a new lease term that seems fairer. That doesn't happen, at least not very often. And so what the tenant has to do is, or prospective tenant has to do, is find a different landlord, which we all know is if they're looking for a fairer lease and a fairer landlord, shopping for a home can be time consuming, intimidating, and expensive. That's why we need stronger protections for tenants through improved and updated tenant landlord state law. Minnesota tenant law is outdated. First of all, I just want to state there's many ways that this is the case. It's outdated compared to what other states have. For instance, there's this thing called duty to mitigate, where most states have that if a tenant has to end their lease early, that both the landlord and the tenant must make some effort to find another tenant to fill that unit. Minnesota does not have that. We're outdated with what many other states on this issue and many other issues take into account. Tenant landlord law is also outdated because technological advances. Through the last thorough review of tenant landlord law took place before the internet went public. It was before the Berlin Wall fell. And it was before the first Back to the Future movie came out. We got some time to make up here. Things like the internet have been created and people text and have phones that carry around their way of communication, but Minnesota law hasn't kept up to date on those sorts of things. We're also out of date with the changing nature of the rental market, that landlords used to call a couple of prior landlords to do reference checks on tenants, and now a landlord can easily access court records. Because of this, because our tenant landlord law is outdated, in 2024, Homeline will be advocating at the state legislature that we actually do a more thorough review of tenant landlord law, that we update it in the ways that that has to happen, and we catch up with other states in those cases as well. This year, Homeline will be leading advocacy to change tenant landlord law on 8 issues. There are 3, and then additional 3 issues that we'll be working with inside a coalition of folks.
Michael, can I jump in for a second?
Sure, go ahead.
I just want to make sure I understood the dates, because you just said 2024, and then you said this year.
This year. I'm sorry, 2023.
This year, you mean 2023. So
Yes.
the slide before was kind of the stuff we're going to work on in the future, real future. The stuff you're going to talk about in a second is the stuff we're going to work on next month.
Next month, and I jumped ahead because I'm just so excited to start working at the legislature, and it's the 2023 state legislative session. So thanks, Mike, for correcting that. So for this year, and if it was 2022, we wouldn't have the time to do any of this, but for this year, we are going to be pushing for a number of things, but I want you to remember landlords write the leases. And so again, we need state law to help balance the scale. And so here are some of the staples that we have. We think that staples for a happy home include having a warm home, that there's a right to privacy for tenants, that there's rent transparency, which I'll get into later what this means, an expanded list of emergency repairs, a lower cost for tenants that file court actions, the right to break a lease for health needs, that a landlord would do a pre-eviction notice if for non-payment of rent, and that there be reforms to eviction reporting or expungement of records. So let's put this on a shopping list. Let's just take a look at what that looks like. We're going to go around with this shopping list and tell legislators this is this is what our agenda is. But why do we need to go to the state legislature? Again, I just want to say that, and next slide, renters shouldn't have to shop around for basic tenant rights and protections. When you're shopping for a home, there are certain things that you come as expectations that some renters can't, but renters, again, should not have to shop around for basic tenant rights and protections. And so we want to have this not be a shopping list, and state very clearly on top of it that this statement of this is not something that should be controlled by the market, but instead that the state legislature needs to step in and take some action. And so for the rest of my slides, I'm going to talk about specifics of things that we want. And I'm going to start a warm home by saying that we have a hodgepodge of city adopted minimum heat codes across the state. Many of those cities have not ordinances, but they're using state building code, and that those building codes simply say that the equipment has to be capable of heating to a certain temperature, but not actually that they maintain that apartment temperature. So we're going to have legislation that say that we would enact a statewide heat code enforceable by both city rental inspectors and by tenants through their own private court actions. It would require units where the tenant does not control the heat, where they don't control the thermostat, that from October 1st to till April 30th, the heat would be maintained at a minimum of 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's what we're asking for in a warm home as a basic thing that tenants deserve.
Can we go back to that for a second, Rachel? That slide, thank you. So Michael, on this issue, and I've been working on these things with you for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And this is the one to me that has always been the hardest to understand why it isn't the rule already. I mean, I don't know what the temperature is where the people watching in the Zoomosphere are watching us today, but where I'm at, just south of St. Paul, working from home today, it's pretty cold and it's miserable driving conditions, or at least it was dropping my son off for school today. Why do we not have a rule already on heat? That there's not some statewide rule that says, you know what, make it warm enough for all your tenants. Why doesn't that just already exist?
Well, first of all, is that we have opposition. The Minnesota Multi-Housing Association has expressed the views of some of the landlords that raise this issue with legislators. Talk about, well, their building is old and the heating system is not something where shutting it off and on, especially at the beginning of this winter or the late fall session, that it's just hard, and what it ends up doing is it ends up heating some of the upper units more than 68 degrees, and they want it to sort of have the option to know sort of when it actually is going to be cold for a sustained period of time, and then they'll turn the heat on. The problem with that is that with all these fluctuations in heat outside or cold outside, that the tenant is the one suffering. And what might be needed is some good weatherization of buildings to help address the situation. But, you know, it's mainly what do you do about these in-between times where it gets cold and then warm and cold and then warm? And landlords want some control over the fact that they don't feel like that's something that should be regulated by the state. I would also point out that other places, there are places throughout the state that have these same sorts of buildings, that have these same sorts of issues, or have had these same sorts of issues, but there is a city ordinance that says exactly what we're proposing. In fact, most cities that have ordinances say something very close to what we're proposing, and the landlords have lived with the situation and actually found a way to operate in a way that best suits the needs of their tenants.
So you're just saying that what on this issue, we're just trying to fill in the gap for the cities or the tenants that don't happen to live in a city that has an ordinance already similar to what we're proposing. We're not making this up, brand new, nobody's ever seen anything like this kind of concept. This is one that we already have in big chunks of the state.
Exactly, and it's not something that is just the code is or the ordinances we find that they've been passed in. Oh gosh, I'm not going to get it right, but if it's Worthington and Wilmer, I mean, one of those two cities has in Greater Minnesota this is exact language. Minneapolis has something very similar to this language, as does St. Paul. Some parts of the state have things that are a little bit more stringent and some that are a little more relaxed, but this is basically what every city that has a city ordinance that passed has used as a guideline for, or not a guideline, but as the ordinance for what the heat should be in the apartments.
Thanks.
Okay, so moving on to privacy. I'll start with a story. We heard from one of Homeline's clients who lives in Fridley that the person was in the bathroom with the door closed and the son ran to the door saying, "Mommy, someone's in the apartment." And it was the landlord. And the landlord said that they were there for maintenance and had used the key to enter the apartment. The landlord claimed that he had every right to come in unannounced whenever he wants because he owns the property. So one problem is that current law doesn't say that the landlord must provide. Our current problem is that landlord has to provide reasonable notice, and it just says reasonable. Now, obviously, reasonable notice was not provided in any way, shape, or form in this story that I just referenced. But obviously, it is the case that many landlords think that because they own the rental property and they own the unit, that they have complete control over it. But it's important to note that the law says when someone's paying rent, it is their home. It is that they control who enters, who does not, and that the landlord has to provide right now reasonable notice. And what Homeline is proposing is that we require a landlord to give at least 24 hours notice when entering the tenant's home, that the landlords be able to only enter between the hours of 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. and would have to give a 4-hour window for when they would enter. And unlike currently, where there exists little meaningful recourse for these violations, tenants would be able to sue the landlord for a meaningful penalty, which we say is 1 month's rent and reasonable attorney fees.
And again, are we making up all of this stuff from our, hey, this should be the rule, so let's decree something and then propose it to legislators? Or where do we get these notions, the 24-hour notice, the between 8 and 8, and having right now the penalty is $100 for every time that a landlord enters a rental unit in violation of the statute. That's it, $100. So where did we come up with these versions of this?
Well, I may ask for you for a little help, but we do something called a state review of what other states do, and 24 hours notice is something that many states require landlords to provide when entering an apartment. Regarding the $100 amount, this was something that was proposed years ago, and things like inflation have happened. And also it costs more to go to court than the actual reward would allow, the award would allow. And so we're not just sort of making these things up. We're using what other states have done, as well as reasonable adjustments to what would make this meaningful for a tenant to actually go to court, file an action and of a privacy invasion, and then be awarded something that would be a clear message to the landlord that they need to comply. I don't know if I answered your question completely there, but the state-by-state review is what we do.
So I think what you're talking about is kind of referring back to what you started with at the beginning, where you mentioned kind of the modernization of landlord-tenant law. So I think things like inflation, this law that you're talking about right now, I believe was 1995, I want to say, was when it passed through the legislature. And $100 doesn't mean what it did then. And I think at that point, to file a rent escrow, it would have cost about $20 to file, and now it's about $70. So it costs more, like you say, than it did to file the case. The benefit, if you're looking at $20 with a $100 potential win if you win, versus $70 for a $100 win if you win, nowhere near as good of percentage odds wise. But the other part of the modernization is you're saying that we're trying to model ourselves on what other states have, because again, hearing what you're saying, a tenant in, for instance, Pennsylvania might have just a lot more rights than a tenant in Minnesota. And we're trying to figure out how to address that.
Yeah, and I think it's really is kind of a conservative approach in some areas where we're just saying, follow what most of the rest of the nation does on this. And we definitely tell legislators when we're just way behind on what other states allow. And there are rental markets that exist in these states and they operate just fine. And there's no reason that Minnesota should feel or act or that there would be much different.
Well, you mentioned it with the city code with heat too. Hey, look,
Yeah.
Minneapolis landlords are already operating with this. Why is it so hard for a landlord in a city that doesn't have one of these ordinances that specifically says a temperature, which is such a knowable thing, right? That's a pretty objective question. What does the thermometer say? Not, oh, I'm cold. That's not enough. You actually have to have a thermometer. But anyhow, I'll jump back and let you keep going.
Okay. Well, one thing that we often hear is, well, what about, the weather in, and then some northern city is raised, and, uh, it may be cold there and not cold in the cities. And I'm like, cold is cold. Where, 68 degrees is the same wherever you are across the state. That we want to provide a uniform measure. And so, again, uniformity is a big thing in many of the things that we're proposing. Now move on to the next one for rent transparency. Start with a story again. There was a tenant in Maple Grove who was set to move into their apartment. Landlord had provided a welcoming letter with the costs and utility and rent that the tenant had to cover. The tenant thought that everything was in order, and in reality, the costs listed in the lease were nowhere near the actual amount. What started as a utility bill of about $100 to $200 a month ended up paying for many other things: water, sewer, gas, electricity, two trash removal charges, and administrative fees totaling $400 a month. So obviously, this tenant didn't know what they were getting into, not regarding, they can say it's just fees, but actually this is monthly rent. It's just disguised as fees. An increasing number of landlords are using fees actually for non-optional services. Not all landlords, but there's an increasing number that are using these, and these may include move-in or move-out fees, administrative fees, lease processing fees, fees to access a renter portal to pay for rent. So, to access the I'm going to pay rent now may cost $7.95 and gets tacked on to the regular expense that a renter has to pay rent. There are amenity fees, there are any other service fees, and these fees are in some cases, and most of the time, in the lease, but they're rarely mentioned in the rent amount advertised to tenants so they feel like you're raising the rent on them, and this means that some landlords are able to draw in potential tenants with a deceptively lower advertised rent and then effectively raise the rent without much recourse for tenants if they didn't know what they were signing or weren't paying as much attention as they should or could have. That these other fees are in the lease. Now,
so the real problem is with the advertising, as near as I can tell what you just said. I mean, it's in the lease, right? So the tenant could read it and say yes or no to whatever they want. I mean, you mentioned earlier that tenants don't get to really negotiate leases, which as one of the people in the office that talks to tenants on a regular basis, I can certainly confirm that it's really hard for a tenant to negotiate a lease. If you don't mind me sharing a brief story, I give a lot of landlord speeches.
Go ahead.
And I was in Albert Lee, just right almost into Iowa a couple weeks ago. And I was talking about some tenant issues and landlord issues. And a landlord was trying to understand why landlord tenant law really existed at all. Like, it doesn't really make sense that the government steps in. This is a private contract between two parties. What right does the government have to have any role in regulating these private contracts? Which is kind of a fundamental question that gets asked a fair amount, even by legislators, is, hey, this is a contract. We shouldn't be involved at all. And then I said, well, let me ask you a question. When you do your application for a lease and the tenant gets approved, I'm guessing that you don't say to the tenant, hey, tenant, bring over your favorite lease and then I'll sign it. Right.
Right.
And the room of landlords laughed like, oh, that is just the dumbest thing anybody's ever said, that the tenant would provide the lease. And what I told the landlords was, you guys laughing is the reason why we have those laws, because we all know that landlords always write these leases. And so tenants don't really have, in residential settings, much ability to negotiate meaningfully when it comes to a lease. They just don't. It's not recognizing the market. And one thing I always point out as well is that fact that the law regulates rental. Invading a private contract space, that fact is true in every state in the country. Minnesota isn't some left-leaning place. It's the only place that has tenant rights. No, a landlord can't throw somebody out without going through court pretty much anywhere in the country, because we have landlord-tenant laws. Because we've decided, I guess, societally, that we think that we need to intervene because these contracts are so one-sided. And so this part, so the tenant could look at the fees and say, oh, I want to negotiate those out. My problem with the fee issue is what you brought up, which is the advertising. So the landlord runs an ad saying it's $9.99. Tenant sees that on Craigslist or Housing Link or somewhere else, and they know what their budget is, right? So describe why we need this once the landlord has said $9.99. Why did the landlord say $9.99? What are they trying to accomplish by saying that instead of naming the actual number of rent?
They're trying to lure in tenants who want that place and may actually see it as, they see it before they see the lease and truly want it and make plans about where it is they'll be living. There could be lots of tenants that are actually at the same time proposing that, or seeing that advertisement. It's a way to lure in tenants and to have them sort of see the place as a place that they want to live, and to feel some pressure, because let's face it, today's rental market is not one where renters have a lot of options when they're on the lower income level. And so for a rent to be at that level, a tenant might not feel like there's many other options for them. And so there's a certain pressure to get a home as quickly as you can, because there aren't enough homes for everybody that exists in this community at rents they can afford. And so I think that also plays a role. I would bet that you have something else you'd like to add to this, but I think the marketplace is just one where renters in many ways do not feel like they have the upper hand.
So, but again, just kind of a numerical thing here. $9.99, the landlord advertises there because, I mean, if you type in a search on Craigslist, one of the things you might do is say, I want to live in Maple Grove. That's where my kids want to go to school. So you narrow down the city. You might also say, I want to have rents between $500 and $1,000, right? So if a landlord advertises at $9.99, it pops up. I'm going to see that one. But when I get there and I've already applied, paying $30 an adult to apply, and I've spent time and effort. I drove there. I looked around. I did a tour of the place. I still haven't seen the lease, by the way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though I've applied. And then the landlord says, well, the place is yours. Here's the lease. And you look it over and you realize that it isn't $9.99 a month, with just a couple of the fees you talked about. Some sort of, you have to pay, these exist. You have to pay your rent fees, right? You can only pay electronically, and there's a $4 charge per payment. Or if you want to pay for it with a check, it's $20, right? But there's no way to pay for free, or the administrative fees you talked about, which maybe make it so that the average rent throughout the year isn't $9.99. It might be $1,050 when we're done with fees. And at the pace we're going, by the way, next year it'll be $1,100 when it's at $9.99, because landlords seem to see fees, think it's okay, and then they keep going with the fees. Is what we're watching. I can tell you from our hotline's perspective, we can't predict tomorrow's fee because we're surprised by them constantly. Once a month, we get a fee that comes in none of us have ever seen before. And we're just like, what is that? What? They're charging for that now? You can't keep up with the fees. And so that's why we're trying to do this, right? Is if it's $9.99, the tenant's going to pay at the beginning of each month $9.99, not $1,050.
You got it. And like I said, the tenant may fall in love with the apartment, the place, the area that it is, and then find this out and consider that there's probably not other options.
And you're talking about stuff that's beyond money there. You're talking, I think, about hope. The
Yeah,
tenant has invested hope in that place. And we all only get so much of that.
Yeah.
So I hate to see that part of it as well. Rachel, you had a thought.
I just wanted to also say, like, we're talking about fees, obviously, and this is a big one, but um there's the as it's proposed, I guess, or how we would like it to be, would it say that these fees that landlord can't charge these fees, or
sure.
are
Yep.
they saying that it just has to be upfront about what the fees are?
So, I mean, one approach to take on this is that the advertisement has to list all the fees, which I guess can happen. I don't know that I'd want to be that landlord advertising countless fees on top of the current rent, but that is a possibility. Our proposal is this, that non-refundable fees for non-optional services have to go into the cost of rent. And that's why the slide says rent transparency. It's not fee transparency, it's rent transparency. How much does it cost for a tenant on a monthly basis to rent the property and that their apartment, and that it includes all of the fees? There are no concealed charges until lease signing, and that all those costs must be thrown into the rent. The tenant understands how much they have to pay each month, and then they enter the lease and the budget accordingly. Now, I want to say a couple of things. One is we've been generically using the term landlords, and I don't want to be pejorative in any sense. We get the calls from tenants who are having difficulties. And so we get, these are real problems for real people and at numbers that are very high, but it isn't something that's happening everywhere. And we want to make sure that we recognize that there are landlords that aren't using these practices as well. The second point I want to make is that optional fees, where the services are optional, like a pet rent, that's totally allowable. Someone may have the cat or the dog, and they may have to decide that they can't live in a particular apartment because they don't accept pets, or that the pet rent is too high. There can also be optional parking fees if someone wants a parking stall, or a garage, and so those are fees that are, in our mind, things that the tenant has to say yes to, and they realize that there's an extra expense attached to that. So we're not against all fees. We're against fees where it's non-optional, for a service or a administrative fee that should really just be wrapped into the monthly rent.
So Michael, I apologize, but I'm going to ask one process question, because if people have been following this sort of thing recently, in recent times, the last two topics that we talked about, privacy and rent transparency, those were kicked around, and I think they even, if I get the legislative phrasing right, they passed through the House, right?
Actually, everything that you are going to hear about in this presentation passed the State House.
So can you explain to me, does that mean that the Senate just takes it now, or it can go straight to the, how does it work? I mean, logistically, if the House already passed this, where are we at in the process? Do we have to start all over? Or, I mean, is it a place where, since the House did it, then the Senate could hear it right now and vote on it?
I'll talk a little bit about this later, but the state runs on a biennial basis, which means it runs on a 2-year basis. 2023, we're starting the process anew. So it's sort of like taking an Etch-a-Sketch and saying we need to start everything up again. Now, we have language that we've used in previous years. That language is going to, in almost all cases, stay the same as what we had proposed in previous years. The advantage we have is that a number of legislators have heard this. Again, it passed the full House. We didn't receive hearings in the Senate, so we really have to put a lot of work there. But we also know that this was a legislative election where a lot of new legislators came in. I believe it's something like 20% of all legislators are new. And and there's changed committees, and these committees may not have the same people that they had on them before. So we'll have to educate new legislators. So we're at the beginning of a 2-year process. We've got a lot of folks to educate, but it's working with something that some of the legislature knows, what we talked about before. Next year, I hope we pass everything. Through the House, through the Senate. The governor says it's all good, and all these things become law. And for anything that doesn't, we get to go into next year with the assumption that we have, there'll still be some procedural things that have happened, but we won't need to write a new law. We'll have a bill number and authors and all of the things that you get in the legislative process, as well as the same people who are making the decisions about your issues.
And you've mentioned the word "we" a lot. So we don't actually, being Homeline, since we all the speakers today work at Homeline, we don't actually get to introduce legislation. We can recommend stuff. We can submit stuff to people that might, but ultimately it's some legislative member, right, that has to introduce anything. So it's their bill that we might support, but the "we" part is a little bit tricky sometimes.
I'm sorry, I'm an organizer. I like to own, community owned for a lot of things. And so I use the word "we." You're absolutely right. A legislator has to tell me, Michael, you have my permission to go and speak to someone like a reviser, is what they're called at the state legislature, to write up this language. We might use something that you have as an example, but someone at the legislature is going to actually write the language and package it up so that there's a House and a Senate version that's equal, that is introduced in both the House and the Senate, and then moves forward through the process in each of those bodies. But for all of the legislation that I'm talking about, I had to get another legislator to say yes and give us the authority to make sure that it's in the form that it needs to be when we first introduce it. So, okay, I'm going to move on to the next one. So after rent transparency, Homeline believes, next slide please, that there be an expanded list of emergency repairs. So tenant landlord law right now says that emergency issues are things like loss of running water, loss of hot water, loss of heat, electricity, sanitary facilities, basically a bathroom that's working order, and then other essential services. Essential services are a catch-all phrase, but no one really knows exactly what that protects. And so tenants instead are forced to wait days without resolution in dealing with something that isn't classified as an emergency issue, but might be very costly or detrimental to their health. So our legislation would expand emergency issues to include no working refrigerator, no working air conditioner if it was advertised and included in the lease. If there's loss of any conditions, services, or facilities that pose a serious and negative impact on the health or safety of a tenant, or if there's a notice to require a notice to intent to condemn property for unsafe or unsanitary conditions. Also included would be non-working elevators and serious infestations. So that's what's in our expanded emergency repairs list, and we'll see where it fares. We certainly think that the health and safety is, people are may need air conditioners because they have asthma and their health care. They're taking care of their health by having an air conditioner, other things that might negatively impact them that they have to be included in this expanded list of emergency repairs. Okay, next slide. We want to lower the cost for tenants to file court actions. Currently, tenants pay only $70 for filing a rent escrow, which covers general repair orders and requests by tenants to their landlords. Emergency repairs, which are called emergency tenant remedy actions, or ETRAs, cost $300 to file. And we believe that tenants shouldn't have to pay over 4 times the amount in dealing with emergencies as they are for normal repairs. In fact, why shouldn't they just be the same thing? And that's exactly what we're proposing, is that the filing fee be somewhere around $70 to $80 for the filing fee for both emergencies and non-emergencies. Next slide, please. Right to break lease for health needs. Minnesota doesn't allow a tenant to break their lease due to a medical condition. And what we would do is change that so that we'd allow renters who have a physician certified medical condition, illness, or disability that hinders their ability to remain in their current housing would be able to move and have a 2-month notice to move out of their home and find someplace else. This has to do with the medical that it worked for them medically, or that it's accessible if that's what needs to be provided, that they have that sort of housing unit. This is becoming more of an issue because more renters are having to move into assisted living. And so we think it's just a good idea to get ahead of this or catch up with this, but not quite as far as we are in some laws, and just make this the law so that we are helping people who really, we don't want them to have to make a decision between their health or where they live. And that's what's happening in many cases now. Next slide. Okay, pre-eviction notice for non-payment of rent. Another story. We have a tenant from Minneapolis who was a single mother with 3 kids, and she lost her job and became behind on rent. Their landlord agreed to give them time to pay back the rent, but then it was filed filed an eviction action anyway, even though they said that they would wait to have the rent paid. The tenant was eventually able to pay back everything she owed, but is now juggling to try to find housing and a job while taking care of her children. And all she needed was a little bit more time during the difficult time that she was facing. Right now, evictions can be filed very quickly and often without the tenant's knowledge. Here at Homeline, we have a letters project where we're actually sending out letters to people when we know that evictions have been filed against them in court. And we're often the first point of contact that this is something that has happened. Pre-eviction notice, we're way behind. We're one of only 4 states that does not require a landlord to formally notify a tenant before filing an eviction action for non-payment of rent. And what we would do is we are going to introduce a pre-filing notice legislation that would require landlords to give their tenants 14 days before filing an eviction. This would provide the tenant the time and the opportunity to fix the problem, to negotiate an agreement with their landlord, to vacate the apartment, the unit, making an eviction filing unnecessary. The pre-filing notice would also include information on what sort of assistance that people can apply for to get help. We think that this is, we're just way behind on this. We need to catch up. And evictions, once they're filed, the court case hasn't even been heard, but that simple eviction action is on their court record and would have to be filed to be expunged. We think this notice would be the prodding that a tenant needs. It would also serve as the notice that there's an emergency, and different forms of assistance only carry forward when there's an emergency. And that emergency right now is often that an eviction has been filed against them. And what we would say, and what the law does, the bill actually says is that this is a notice that an emergency has actually begun once the landlord has sent them a non-payment of rent notice.
And again, just like on the heat issue, we have a few cities that have actually dabbled with this concept already in Minnesota. So you mentioned one of only 4 states, but Minneapolis, St. Louis Park, and Brooklyn Center all have pre-eviction filing notices that have been adopted in the last 2 years, roughly. And so if there is landlord opposition to this notion, and a landlord says something like, well, we're going to be run out of business if this law gets passed where a 14-day notice is required, the fair question would be to ask, well, are there any Minneapolis landlords still in business? Because they have pretty much the exact same thing, a 14-day notice requirement. Brooklyn Center requires 30 days notice before a landlord can file an eviction. So the experiments can happen at the city level and sort of drift up if it looks like, well, that didn't collapse the rental industry. But anyhow, there's not just other states, but cities in Minnesota that have adopted something like this already.
Thanks for that additional info. And we'll be taking a look at well, we know that we want to give adequate time to actually resolve an issue before something becomes a court issue. And so we're taking a look at the cities to see how if evictions are being prevented and if there's time to actually address the issue. So next slide, please. We want to reform eviction reporting. This is also known as eviction expungement, but basically we want to say that eviction reporting should be prohibited. Actually, I shouldn't say basically. There's a number of things that we want here. An eviction should be prohibited until a court judgment has actually been rendered in favor of the landlord. Something shouldn't go on the record just because a landlord has filed a court action. It actually should be heard by a court judge or referee, and this gives the tenants the opportunity to remedy the situation before it harms the record. The court would order an expungement if the tenant prevailed in the case. You think about it, you have something on your court record saying that an eviction action has been filed against you, you succeed, and this is still on your record. That it isn't automatically removed because you won in the case. If the case was dismissed, we think that it should be expunged or shouldn't be reported on, shouldn't be available for others to see. If the parties agreed to an expungement upon the request of the tenant and the case was settled because the tenant fulfilled the terms of the agreement, an expungement should be filed. And then an eviction would be ordered if an eviction was ordered 3 or more years ago, an expungement should just happen automatically. The court could consider expungement if there had been a change in a defendant's circumstances indicating the eviction is not a reasonable predictor of the tenant's future behavior. This gives a judge more discretion in taking a look at reasonable decisions about an eviction, whether or not to do an expungement. Someone maybe lost a job and then very quickly, soon thereafter, found another job. They're going to be able to pay rent. This isn't going to predict what their future looks like. A judge would say that an eviction does not belong on the record. Rachel, I see you're up.
I am. I wanted to point out quick, jumping back slightly to the pre-eviction notice. We'd mentioned that there were 3 cities that already did pre-eviction notice, and Dave in our Q&A also pointed out that manufactured home parks also have a pre-eviction notice requirement as well. So again, just to reiterate, reemphasize, this isn't new territory for Plakes.
I'd like to thank Dave, and I think I know him.
And I actually have a really quick story as well about this one, about expungement reporting. I actually was speaking with a tenant this morning who her landlord had filed an eviction potentially in error. I don't know what happened, but they literally filed it one day and then also requested it be dismissed that same day. They put in the paperwork for it. That eviction is still showing on her record, even though it's something where the landlord clearly made a mistake. But that wasn't, it's still there, and she's now got to pay the fee to be able to try and get it expunged from her record.
These sorts of things shouldn't happen, and that's why we're working on them. Thanks, Rachel. Okay, there are some other issues that we're working on that we're not taking the lead on, but we're working inside coalitions. And one is that there's a source of income protections. We think that if someone receives a subsidy, whether or not it's a Section 8 subsidy, a Bridges subsidy, or some other form of a subsidy, that a landlord should not be able to discriminate against them in how they pay their rent. Right now, as Mike likes to say, you can take a look at Craigslist and there'll be a huge number of advertisements that say Section 8 tenants need not apply. And this, we think, is discrimination, that it's, we believe it goes against the state's human rights statute and should just be ended. Emergency rental assistance. We're still dealing with the results of a pandemic. And so for $100 million per year we would be putting in to address what is still a very tumultuous situation for renters, and that we find ways to help them through their emergency rental needs. The Bring It Home campaign, we just need to recognize that housing is unaffordable. And this proposal says that for those making 50% below the area median income, who are paying more than 30% of their income for housing, would get a subsidy. It's not, it's something that is going to require that the legislature really invest, but it's just showing how long it's been since we've received a serious amount of subsidy to help people through or help them afford housing that is currently unaffordable in this market. If you have 30%, 20 or 10% of the area median income, it's going to be very difficult for you to find a place to rent, and the quality of a place you do find might not be the best either. Renter's credit expansion. There is actually a proposal to increase the renter's credit, and to do so in two ways. One is to take it to stop it from being something that you file at the beginning of the year and you wait until August to actually receive it. But instead, when you file your tax forms, you write your income, you write what you received as far as from the landlord about the property taxes that you paid, and that this would lead to people who didn't know about the renter's credit would automatically get it because it's on their tax form. And then also it would increase the renter's credit on average by about $200. So this is a huge proactive thing that we can be working on at the legislature, that I'll be talking a little bit about in just a couple of minutes here. Also, Homeline is actively involved in the Homes for All Coalition. I'm a public policy team co-chair of the coalition, and so we're very involved in the broad array of housing issues that need to be addressed, not just rental policy issues. Next slide. Just a little bit of context, and I want to make sure that we have some time for questions and answers. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here. I want to note that in previous years, that Governor Walz and the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency have put three of the things that have already been proposed. 14-day pre-eviction notice, eviction expungement reform, and the source of income protections. It is our hope that that will happen again. We know that it's something that is being bantered about at in the executive branch, and so we're hopeful that that we have some agreement here and can move forward with the governor also taking some leadership on this issue, on these issues. Regarding leadership itself, one of the Senate's highest champions for affordable housing and rental policy changes is Senator Dietzich, and she's actually going to become the Senate Majority Leader. And then Senator Port, who was again a champion of affordable housing rental policy change issues, is going to be taking over the Housing Committee. In the House of Representatives, we have Representative Howard and Representative Becker-Finn, who are chairing the Housing and then the Judiciary Committee respectively, that we feel like we have some friends leading those committees because they've been supportive of our efforts over the past few years, even though we haven't been able to get our bills past the finish line. I want to point out that the pace of the legislative pace can feel strange. Sometimes it goes very quickly, like drop everything and we need testifiers now. And that's not a great place to be. It's not always respectful of the people that we're working with who have lived experience. Sometimes it happens though, and so we're very thankful to the tenants who are willing to tell their story and be available on short notice about these issues. And then sometimes it moves very slowly, and it seems like it takes a month, and maybe it does take a month for you to get a bill hearing. And so we just need to be aware that the legislature is not a predictable thing each year. The assumptions seem to change somewhat about how things should move forward. And both of the House and the Senate have different timelines for how they operate. So again, thank you to everybody who's able to accommodate that schedule. Also, just to note that we have opposition. The Minnesota Multi-Housing Association is they would say has concerns, and I would say that they're opposed to our agenda. They'll lobby against it, and they'll testify against it and raise their concerns during the committees. We are hoping to meet with them to talk over these issues again, but we think that we're going to be basically saying the same things that we've been saying to each other for the past 4 years now, and so we have to hope that there's a better environment for us to move forward to these issues in the House and the Senate, and that the governor will sign these issues into law. Okay, and then next slide. I just want to say that if you're a renter, I've been told by Representative Becker-Finn, you're going to play your inside game, what happens inside the Capitol, but what really matters is the outside game. And what that means is renters, we need you to write, call, and or visit your legislators. And if you do not know what this means or how to do it, please contact me at my email address provided on this slide, michaeld@homeline.org. If you want to call, write, or visit your legislator, I will help you. If you want to share your story with Homeline about how the 2023 Minnesota Renters Agenda will help you out, share your story with us. Again, you can email me directly, and I will make sure that your story is one that has the biggest bang for the buck. And lastly, if you receive the renter's credit, and if it's helpful to you, it helps you buy school supplies, it helps you get your car repaired, it helps you buy Christmas presents, whatever it does, share with us your name, your address, so that we can connect you to a legislator. And then we would like to actually let legislators know on your behalf how the renter's credit helps you, and how an increased renter's credit that gets to more people and also increases the amount that's available is something that you are supportive of. And we'll have a more extensive campaign that we'll release about this a little bit later, but again, feel free to contact me directly. Next slide. I just want you all to remember, renters should not have to shop around for basic tenant rights and protections. We don't want a shopping list that where the market is the only way that you get these protections. We want you to be have these issues covered under state law, so that you can pay attention to more things like, can you find a 2-bedroom in the community that you want to live in with the amenities that you're hoping for in your apartment? That's what belongs on your shopping list, not these basic tenant rights and protections. And I think I'm going to let Rachel manage the rest of the conversation here.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was great. Thank you. I'm actually going to switch back real quick to your contact information, just in case people do have questions or want to contact you, so they can get that written down. We had a quick question from Anonymous about CRP stuff. They're asking, can the renter's credit be similar income thresholds to owner homesteading ones?
It's not going to happen, unfortunately. I know the homeowners have significantly higher income levels that apply, and I don't know if the proposal is to bring down the home ownership one or to raise the renters. I have heard no talk about bringing the renters income levels to homeowners levels. I think that there's a basic inequity that's at play here, and there's just no getting around that. That's what is happening. But I would want to support the proposal at the legislature that has the greatest amount of relief that's being provided to tenants as possible. So I'm sorry, I don't see what you're asking for as possible, but I do see what is truly the proposal that went through last year and was being talked about in the tax committee, conference committee, was just a huge change, significantly more available, and thousands of additional renters that would receive the renters credit rebate. So, yeah.
Thank you. And then Anonymous also asked if the agenda was online. It is already online. I am going to drop the link to that in the chat here. So, but that got posted just a little bit ago. So.
Yep. And that includes the issues that we're taking a lead on. We'll
Mhm.
probably add there fairly shortly some of the coalition efforts that we're part of as well.
All right.
But those
Perfect.
are the lead issues.
All right. All right. And so that's it for our the presentation part of this. There were a couple of questions that were pre-submitted that I will go ahead and ask those, as well as some of the questions that came in on the Q&A. Some of them are going to be more specific to, I believe, what Mike has to offer for the conversation. But first off, the fact that, well, all right, so Catherine wanted to know, this was from the pre-submitted questions, where does the legislature stand regarding all facets of affordable housing? I know that's a very broad question, so if you want to pick something.
Well, first of all, I'll just say that the leadership in the House and Senate seem much more amenable to affordable housing, rental policy, and homelessness related issues. And we expect that, in the House, working on affordable housing and rental protection issues has been something that the caucus has talked a ton about. New members coming into the legislature heard when they were knocking on doors for votes. And so housing is going to be much more front and center than it has been in the past. The renter protections, there's new members and some of this stuff is confusing. And so it's going to take some time to educate folks, but it's going to be great to educate folks on these issues. We don't know what the committee membership looks like yet. So I can't answer sort of, will the committees be better or worse? What I can say is that there will be new people on these committees and we'll have to educate them. And you get to be a part of that education if you're a renter, in letting them know the issues that you struggle through and the things that would help you out. On affordability, area median income, 80%, 50%, 30%, they're going to be meaningless to many legislators. And again, so we're going to have to do some education about what that actually means and what that means for different income levels and whether or not the jobs in their community pay enough for someone at those levels to find apartments in those communities. So I do think we'll have to do some education there. But again, I do think it's going to be a much more amenable situation for the issues that we've been raising for the past 4 years intensively. But then I think Homeline actually has been advocating for some of these issues since 2008 or earlier. We just need to use this opportunity to move some things through the legislature.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Rosalie, who's a service provider, wants to know what steps in policy are being taken to support not only affordable but accessible housing.
So I believe that I'm trying to remember, the Homes for All Coalition has some issues regarding accessibility that are about not just accessibility for physically, but also that, well, it can be physically, but it's not just about can you get into the apartment with a wheelchair, or is there an accessible shower that you can get into, but also some people can't deal with certain scents, and there's sensory related issues that are at play here. And so I believe that Homes for All is an issue that's regarding this, but regarding Homeline's legislative agenda, you have to help me out here, Mike, but I don't believe that we have anything that sort of makes that that deals with things in that way. It is certainly something, when we do a more thorough review of the tenant landlord law, that we should have in our consideration.
I think the one thing that fits the most into the question, if I had to pick one, would be I have the right to break my lease because
Yeah.
a doctor has said that I have a medical condition, a question that we get often at the hotline. And so that's not really about accessible housing, but the ability to, like I said, end a lease early if somebody needs to because their physical condition has changed.
And accessibility does apply in that place, that someone may need a more accessible unit that simply isn't available in the apartment that they're at.
Right. Thank you for that. And then Anonymous just dropped in, it's not a question really, but they related, they're saying that there was a session between the Minnesota Housing Partnership and the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency about the 2023-2024 agenda around affordable housing from those spaces. So
and we will continue conversations as the legislative session progresses.
mm-hmm. Yeah, so those entities are also a part of this process.
Yep. And Homes for All, Homeline will all be having those conversations. I've had my initial conversation with Minnesota Housing about our agenda, and then Homes for All is also planning a meeting in that regard.
Basically, there's a lot of moving parts, because like you didn't even touch on agencies when we were talking about who all is involved here, and but they are also a part of this process. So yes. We need to do that. But I want to tell you that don't let the moving parts at the legislature scare you. The thing that matters most is, does a constituent care enough to actually raise this issue? You know, I'll use the renter's credit as an example. Many years ago with Homeline, I was carrying around renter's credit shopping bags, and they were stories. We had empty bottles of laundry detergent to say that people bought basic essentials for their apartment. And we filled grocery bags with the empty bottles, because you can't actually give real things to legislators. But we shopped them around to legislators, and they had a tangible impact of, this is how it impacts people in my district. I want us to do something similar to that for the renter's credit, but I also want to have just treasure trove of stories or tenants that are willing to speak to legislators during a hearing. And so again, email me if you have that desire, because you're the most important person. The committees need to hear from real people. They hear from from lobbyists all the time, people like me, but they need to hear from you as well. Thank you, Mike. Mm-hmm. All right, I'm going to switch to Mike now. Give Michael a chance to have some water and put Mike in the hot seat. All right. So there's a couple of questions that came in pre-submitted that were more legal questions. So Carrie, who is a tenant and advocate, I believe, saying that the homeowners lost their home due to property taxes. I'm assuming not paying the property taxes. And the home is rented, and there's a hearing in 2 weeks to vacate. What's that? Are there any things that this tenant can do? And
yeah, Rachel, if you could scroll back to the page where we have our phone number and email and attorney. Thanks. There it is. Yeah, this is one of those ones where I want you to not only contact our office, but I want you to ask for somebody specific. Matt in our office is one of the attorneys who does something that's a very close cousin to this: foreclosures, where landlords have foreclosures filed against them and they lose the home, but the tenant's sort of caught in the middle. And so Matt has dealt with this kind of issue more than anybody else. And that's who that person is going to want to talk to. There's too many pieces of the puzzle that I can't really answer it adequately here, nor would I even actually try. If they called the hotline and I answered the phone, I'd say, you really want to talk to Matt, because he's just waded in these waters more than I have. So in our office, we have people that kind of specialize in certain things, and that's Matt's.
Yep. Yes, he puts it, he has possibly taken the most calls in the entire galaxy related to this subject.
Yeah, tenants being foreclosed on, or landlords being foreclosed on, advising the tenants in Minnesota. Yes, I think that's probably true. I'm not sure why he limited it to the galaxy, though. It seems like it could go a lot broader than that.
True enough.
Yeah.
Probably in a similar vein, Reverend Beth, who's also a tenant and advocate, I believe, wants to know what actions can be taken if there are issues of harassment, defamation, emotional distress, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the same question that you are, and at the end of it, she says how to sue somebody. So what Beth is asking about here is probably stuff that we wouldn't advise on. We'd be talking probably about the right person to talk to would be a personal injury attorney. Personal injury attorneys, there are, I think, thousands in Minnesota. And they are almost always willing to do a free initial consultation. These are the ones that you see on TV sometimes, advertising, have you been hurt at work, that kind of thing. And they'll do a free initial consultation. Almost all of them do. And they also don't charge anything, not really, not up front. They only take cases that they think they have a chance to win, and they think there's enough money to make it worth their while, because at the end they take what we call a contingency. They get a percentage of the money, either in a settlement or in a case that they won, that gets awarded to them. Usually somewhere between 25 and 40% of what was won goes to the attorney. I don't have some list of PI attorneys to recommend, but there are, like I said, hundreds, if not thousands in Minnesota. You Google the geographic area you're in, and maybe even narrow the search a little bit by a little bit more about the specific topic, and you might be able to find some attorney that is willing to take the case on. But it won't be us. We don't file that kind of case.
All right, thank you for that. And then finally, last of the pre-submitted questions, Alana, sorry, a service provider, is asking if there are any enforcement agencies that reinforce landlord repair, neglect, and discrimination accountability.
So there's a couple different categories involved there. Repair and neglect is almost always going to be a city inspector, would be your first stop for a question like that. Not every city has inspections departments, but if a city does have an inspections department, they're almost always free. I guess I saw one yesterday that said that if the tenant calls up an inspector and the inspector finds no grounds for the call or probable cause, or I can't remember the phrasing they had, then they'll charge the tenant $50. But that's the only time I've ever seen that, and it's not one of the core metro cities. Anyhow, calling a city inspector would be the first step with repair and neglect. On the discrimination question, that's a pretty broad topic, but if you're going to have to say, I want to know the one place to start with the discrimination question, it would be the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, which is agency that we refer a lot of people to throughout the year. Sometimes they refer people to us because it fits more with what we're doing. But just to sort of introduce a discrimination question, that might be the best place to start. Although they can call us too, and we can give them some thoughts on what we think of their options. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I just popped their website into the chat.
You're good at that. Thank you.
I am trying.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. And then we did have some questions that came through during the presentation.
Sure.
Basically all of them are anonymous. So
That's
that makes my
fine.
life easy. I don't have to try and butcher names that I apologize for.
Well, I could take my picture off, then I'd be sort of anonymous, although I think it makes my name, yeah, it's not anonymous. So, okay, I'll be non-anonymous. Here we go.
There we go. All right. So first off, someone wants to know, is there a statute? And so what number is it regarding landlords being required to replace carpet and or paint in a certain time frame, for example, every 5 years? And I think both of you might be able to weigh in on this a little bit.
Well, I'll give it a shot first. Michael doesn't really swim in the everyday application of statutes. He works on kind of the big picture theory more, but there is no statute in Minnesota that says that carpet has to be replaced or paint has to be redone every 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. Just doesn't exist in the landlord tenant world. Where we see this issue brought up most is in security deposit disputes, where the tenant has moved out and the landlord is trying to keep the deposit, saying that the tenant damaged the carpet, but maybe the tenant was there for 10 years. So the carpet might have depreciated to very little or no value, which would depend more on the manufacturer's guarantee or sale promise that the manufacturer has. If you go to Home Depot to pick out carpet, it's going to say that it's a 5 or 7 or 10-year carpet. So you'll have some sense of how long carpets are supposed to last. I don't know that I know of any carpets that promise more than a 20-year durability level. But the other type of question we get on this is somebody that's lived in a place for a long time. My landlord has never repainted. I don't want to sign any lease unless they repaint. We talked quite a bit about how hard it is for tenants to negotiate a lease up front. It's a little different when a tenant's been in a place for a while. They might have the ability to negotiate for that, but it also might lead to a higher rent the next year if the landlord does agree to install new carpet or to repaint. But To directly answer the question, there's no magic number of years where the landlord must repaint or shampoo or replace carpet.
And Michael, I was wondering, and I'm putting you on the spot here, so if you don't know the answer, that's fair. Are there other states that do have this sort of thing that you've come across in your 50-state survey?
I rely on some of the other staff to actually provide that research. I don't know if we've done a 50 state on this or not. It's
I
not
don't think we
ringing a bell.
have.
No.
I don't think
Not
we've
ringing a
really
bell.
looked into that deeply. Sorry.
It's a good question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. All right. So another question related to accepting partial payments and eviction. So basically, if lease has language stating eviction filing can be done for unpaid rent, include if the landlord accepts partial payment. If the tenant pays some rent and say 10 days later still has not paid the balance, can the eviction be filed?
Okay, so what this is asking about is a partial payment eviction defense, which is a defense that a tenant can use. It's actually found in the eviction statute in Minnesota. But it's complicated and it's fact dependent. This is the kind of thing where, again, I'd want a tenant to call our tenant hotline. I'll say in general, partial payment defenses don't always win for tenants. It depends on the language of the lease and also the language of the agreement. This question implies that there was some sort of agreement for the tenant to make maybe a staggered number of payments, and they might have made one, but not the second one. And if they didn't, that agreement might say what the landlord is entitled to do if the tenant fails to make payment number 2. So call the hotline, email an attorney directly. I know that somebody sent this question within the last hour or so, and so I'd recommend that you do the same thing through our hotline, and we'll try to get you an answer as quickly as we can, especially if you're able to use our email service, which tends to be a little bit faster turnaround these days, just because of the extraordinary call volume we've experienced over the last 5-6 months.
They asked a second question as well. What if tenant has assistance where they only pay a part of their rent and then some sort of subsidy for the rest of it? What if the subsidy pays but the tenant does not pay their portion?
A lot of variables there, but it might be a case where the tenant has a potential extra defense. It might not be. In the end, if you don't pay your rent as a tenant, eventually the landlord's going to evict you, even if your portion is only a small percentage of the total amount of rent that's due. The landlord will try to go to court and evict a tenant at some point. I can't tell you when, but at some point they'll be motivated to go down to the courthouse and pay their $300 and file the case.
Okay. Next one is also a very specific question, but the person is saying a client I'm working with, their children's father broke into the apartment, and the landlord is charging the tenant for the broken window, which has caused the tenant to get behind on rent payments. Is the tenant responsible for that window repair cost?
It seems like I should have a replay of me saying this is fact specific, and it is. But in short, if a landlord wants to hold a tenant liable for damages, they have to prove that the tenant caused the damage. And here's the legal standard they have to get to: either willfully, which means on purpose, or maliciously, which means on purpose, but like with an evil laugh, right? I'm not sure why malicious is there. Actually, willful should be enough. I don't know why you need malicious, because that's an option. It's not and malicious. It's willfully or maliciously, or irresponsibly somehow caused this. So what I would be trying to figure out with this situation, and the anonymous person that submitted this question said this is a client they're working with. If it is a client that you're working with, the client needs to contact us first. We're attorneys. We have attorneys in our office. Not everybody that works here is an attorney, but everybody's bound by the same attorney-client confidentiality. So we wouldn't be able to talk to the, I'll assume that it's some type of social worker submitting this question. We wouldn't be able to talk to the social worker directly without the tenant's permission first. So I'd much rather you help the tenant compose their own email. And if they want to share our reply with you, that's fine. But, or have the tenant call us themselves. If you write us this email as a social worker, we'll just say, have the tenant call us. And so it delays everything. But this is going to hinge a lot on whether the guy was invited. The father of the kids was an invited guest. It sounds like it's not the situation here. Broke into her apartment through the window does not sound like an invited guest. And so the tenant's argument is going to be, I didn't cause this willfully, maliciously, or even irresponsibly. I didn't know that my boyfriend was going to break the law, or the kid's father was going to break the law and break in through a window. They committed a crime to get in here. I didn't do this. I shouldn't have to pay the $1,000 would be the tenant's argument. I'm not sure I like the sequence of what happened here, where the tenant paid it and is now not paying their rent because they can't afford it. I understand why they might have done that, because they were getting pressure from the landlord. But it might have been more effective to say, I'm not going to pay it, versus paying it and then trying to use that as a reason not to pay the rent going forward. So I don't know that it's going to help in an eviction hearing if the landlord goes and files an eviction for non-payment of rent, because the tenant has already paid that $1,000. But it kind of depends when I get this kind of question in the process. The answer might vary on options the tenant might have.
All right, Catherine has a, this came in during the fee discussion about rent transparency. And I assume a rather dramatic cry of, so they, assuming landlords, can create any kind of fee regardless.
We've seen January fees.
Can you elaborate on that?
A fee, I believe it was $100 fee charged in January by a large landlord
Management company. Yeah.
management company. Had something called a January fee. I think it's now named something different because we've brought it up plenty of times.
Well, Michael,
so-
it's worse now. Do
Oh.
you know that it's worse?
No, I don't.
That landlord so here's the deal. They had a January fee, just like you said, it was $100. So every January, the tenant had to pay a $100 January fee, whether they were month to month or 1 year tenant. Every January, you just had to pay this surcharge fee. As Michael said, we've been complaining about it and kind of using it as an example of what shouldn't happen. And so they've changed it. Now it's a monthly administrative fee, but it's worse. It's $10. The January fee was cheaper if you stayed a full year, because it was only $100. They changed this January fee to a monthly administrative fee instead of just calling it rent.
So yes, in your anger and writing that question, right now, fees of unpredictable types, as Mike had said, every month maybe it's much more frequent, every week we get a new fee that we hadn't seen before. It's just hard to predict what the next one's going to be, and they can be for what seem random things. But again, these are administrative fees. They should be wrapped into the rent, and the renter should know that before they actually apply for the housing. That's our position. That's what we'll be advocating for, and we'll be raising issues like this again.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the day, but if you ask me which of the things that we're advocating for bugs me the most, the fees one is the one that I think is kind of the runaway problem. I don't see any reason why landlords would stop just piling fee after fee after fee on if they're allowed to, because that's what we're seeing happening. They're figuring it out. They keep coming up with new fees. The January fee gets laughed at, so let's call it a monthly fee. It's an administrative fee once a month. Whereas a lot of other landlords have a $300 administrative fee at the beginning of the lease and never again, but still $300, and it wasn't in the ad, right? That you're suddenly asked to pay. And just like all of us, tenants, everybody that moves into any place, you're broke when you move in, because you're spending all your money to get in, right? You got the rental truck, you got friends and family to help you out. You're probably taking extra time off of work, application fees, utility turn on fees, all kinds of expenses, just time, effort, and money. And then somebody says, oh, and yeah, by the way, you owe me another $300, when you've meticulously planned out what you could afford for that moving time. It's just, like I said, I find it inherently deceptive. I really can't stand the fee issue, that we even have to work on it, but we really do have to work on it.
And again, these are some landlords, not all.
No, not all landlords have fees, but it's a growing number.
It's a growing number.
Yeah.
And I like to point out to folks, because one of the things that Homeline doesn't get calls from tenants when things are going well, usually. We get the times that it's, you know, in crisis. So like they were saying, like, it's not every landlord. It may not even be all landlords, but it is something that we see a lot of.
I mean, that's an interesting point, Rachel, because look, I understand why a tenant calls us when they're facing an eviction. They're going to lose their home if they get evicted. I understand when there's a $2,000 security deposit. There's a lot on the line for them. But people call us up saying, is this fee okay? And it's not the same level. It's not the same dollar kind of level, but they can still fundamentally sort of feel like, that doesn't feel fair or right to me. I'm going to check and see if it's legal. And one of the things I point out to people all the time is people will actually call us with a telephone using their voice and ask us about things like a fee. And some of these people are people that don't call much of anybody in the world. They always text everyone. We don't have a text system set up. We have email and attorney, but people will call us with their voice and say, hey, can my landlord charge? That's how fired up they are. They actually talk to somebody on the phone about this issue. In a world where we increasingly have fewer and fewer phone conversations, our calls are going up.
Yeah. And on that note, it is 3 o'clock according to my clock. So
Oh,
thank
hey, it
you both
is.
so much for all of your time and energy put into this. Again, this is being recorded and it will be posted to our website in a day or two. And the 2023 policy agenda is up on our website live. And we will be continuing on with these webinars into 2023. We'll have a recap of kind of some landlord, tenant, landlord specific case law that was sorted out in 2022. I will have a recap of all of that in January. So we'll see you all then. Again, thank you very much and have a wonderful rest of your day.